Hey, you are listening to What the Sigma with Chad Stacks. Today on the show, America just blew past 100% debt to GDP, and the bill to stabilize it is $18,000 per household per year, except nobody's talking about who's actually going to pay it. The federal government now spends $1.33 for every dollar it collects. Debt held by the public just crossed 100% of GDP, sitting at $31.27 trillion against $31.22 trillion in trailing output. And the number that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud is this: stabilizing that ratio by 2036 requires roughly $18,000 per household per year in additional tax burden, not from the rich, from everyone. Let me build this out, because the mainstream framing is almost entirely wrong. The coverage you are seeing right now treats this as a partisan story. Republicans say, cut spending. Democrats say, tax the wealthy. Both framings are politically convenient and mathematically incoherent. The Brookings analysis, run by Jessica Riedel, who is not a right-wing economist, she came out of the Manhattan Institute but is publishing through Brookings, which tells you something about how uncomfortable this math is for the left. Her numbers are the ones that matter here. What happens if you run Bernie Sanders' full tax agenda at the debt? A 77% estate tax combined with an 8% wealth tax closes 18% of the stabilization gap. 18. A 50% income tax rate on incomes above $200,000 for single filers, $400,000 for joint filers, closes roughly 33%. You can confiscate the income of every high earner in America, and you are still two-thirds short of what you need. The income base of the wealthy is simply too small relative to the whole. The only single lever fixes that actually close the gap all land on the middle class. A 12-point across-the-board income tax bracket hike, an 11.5-point payroll tax increase paired with eliminating the Social Security wage cap, which currently sits around $180,000, or a value-added tax in the range of 30%. Those are the numbers. Pick one. Washington will not. The debt per household already sits at $235,000. That is a second mortgage you did not sign for and cannot refinance. Now here is the piece of context that is getting almost no coverage. The same day CRFB confirmed debt crossed 100% of GDP, the BEA released a Q1 GDP print of 2.0% annualized growth, a real rebound from the 0.5% print in Q4 of last year. The financial press covered the GDP number as a recovery story. The fiscal hawks covered the debt milestone as a crisis story. Nobody connected the two. Here is what that connection actually means. Even with the denominator growing at 2%, debt still crossed 100%. The denominator improved and debt won anyway. If you run the math on what growth rate you would need to outpace the current deficit trajectory, you are talking about sustained growth well above anything the CBO or any private forecaster has on the table. Growth is not a solution here. It is a rounding error. The White House, for its part, is claiming the deficit fell over 20% in the president's first full year. The CBO says 2%. Both figures are technically referencing the same fiscal reality. The discrepancy almost certainly comes from a measurement window mismatch, calendar year versus fiscal year, or a cherry-picked monthly comparison window, but it has not been reconciled in any source I have seen. What I can tell you is that CBO's 2% is the multi-source verified number. The White House figure is single source, from the spokesperson, citing St. Louis Fed data in a way nobody has fully audited. File that one accordingly. The 2036 projections also have a small but notable fork. CRFB puts debt at 125% of GDP by 2036. A separate CBO-cited figure puts it at 120%. 5 points is not nothing at that scale. But both numbers share the same directional conclusion. There is no baseline scenario where debt to GDP comes back down. This is structurally different from the post-World War II crossing, when debt fell from its peak back to 34% of GDP within 2 decades. That deleveraging was driven by demobilization, a demographic boom, and sustained high growth. None of those conditions exist now. What exists now is permanent baseline spending driven by aging population mandatory programs, defense, and tax cuts baked in by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and now extended further by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which Republicans are simultaneously marketing as spending discipline and using to add new cuts on tips and overtime. The bill that is supposed to fix the deficit is a net deficit widener. That is the legislative situation. Here is the fact that I think is the single sharpest number in this entire story, and it is buried in a Fortune article. Federal interest expense now equals Medicare outlays. Not approaching, not projected to match, already there. The United States government is paying as much to service its debt as it spends on health coverage for 65 million elderly and disabled Americans, and that interest expense compounds unless rates fall, which the fiscal trajectory makes structurally less likely, not more. The Paulson angle is the missing market-side story. 2 Bloomberg pieces on Treasury market dynamics were blocked from my source bundle, including a Paulson warning about a potential vicious crash in Treasuries. I cannot give you the specifics because I do not have them, and I am not going to invent them. What I can tell you is that permanent 100% plus debt to GDP, combined with a $1.8 trillion annual deficit and structurally higher term premium risk, is the exact setup that makes a hedge fund operator with Paulson's positioning worth listening to. The interest rate channel is where this story lives for anyone with a portfolio. Mortgage rates, corporate spreads, equity multiples, dollar reserve status. All of it sits downstream of what happens to Treasury demand. That conversation is not happening in the mainstream coverage of this milestone. Social Security Retirement Trust Fund insolvency in under 7 years, which would trigger an automatic 24% benefit cut, is being treated as a separate sidebar. It is not a sidebar. It is the primary engine of the debt trajectory colliding with the debt conversation within a single presidential cycle. The entitlement math and the fiscal math are the same math. Nobody in Washington is treating them that way. Riedel's conclusion, published through Brookings, a center-left institution, is that the solution requires everybody to pay, explicitly citing European-style broad taxation. That sentence, coming from that source, is the tell. When the center-left fiscal analyst says the only fix looks like a VAT or a 12-point bracket hike across all income levels, you are past the point where this is a partisan framing question. You are at the point where the bond market becomes the disciplinarian, because no elected official in either party has a vehicle for telling the median household their effective tax rate needs to rise by roughly 15% of income. The base case is stalemate. Stalemate means the deficit does not get addressed legislatively. It means debt hits 120 to 125% of GDP by 2036 on the optimistic path. It means interest expense continues crowding out every other line item in the federal budget. And it means the pressure builds in Treasury markets until it does not. The $18,000 number is not a policy proposal. It is the math telling you what the bill is. The only open question is who presents it and whether it comes from Congress or from a bond auction that goes badly. Remember, nothing said in this podcast is financial advice. This has been another fire episode at What the Sigma. Smash that follow button and tap 5 stars to spread the butter. Fortune favors the bold, baby.
Grab News. Thomas.